Jason Carter sat at a rickety desk in his cramped apartment, his eyes burning from hours of study. The hum of the rain outside provided a steady rhythm to his thoughts as he scribbled notes on legal terminology. At 23, Jason was a third-year law student juggling part-time jobs and a mountain of debt inherited from his late father's failed business. Each day felt like a race against time as bills piled up, and his mother's worsening health weighed heavily on his shoulders. The sharp trill of his phone interrupted the silence. He frowned, glancing at the unfamiliar number. Reluctantly, he answered, his tone cautious. "Hello, Jason Carter speaking." "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," came a composed, almost imperious voice. "My name is Margaret Sinclair. I've been following your circumstances for some time now and believe I may have a solution to your financial troubles. Would you meet me for lunch tomorrow at Sinclair's Cafe?" Jason blinked, the words landing like a thunderclap. Who was this woman, and why did she know about his struggles? The call ended before he could ask more questions, leaving him both intrigued and unsettled. The next day, curiosity and desperation drove Jason to the cafe. Sinclair's Cafe was an upscale establishment far beyond his means, its polished floors and elegant decor making him feel out of place in his threadbare jacket. A hostess guided him to a corner table where Margaret Sinclair sat, her presence commanding the space effortlessly. At 71, Margaret was the picture of poise, her silver hair styled immaculately, her tailored suit exuding wealth. She gestured for Jason to sit, her piercing gaze scrutinizing him as if she were weighing his very soul. "I won't waste your time, Mr. Carter," she began, her tone matter-of-fact. "You are drowning in debt, and your mother's medical needs only add to your burdens. I have the means to eliminate those problems. All I require in return is your agreement to marry me." Jason stared, stunned into silence. Margaret's words seemed surreal, a proposition so bizarre that he wondered if he'd misheard her. "I don't understand. Why would someone like you want to marry me?" Margaret smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "The reasons are my own. Suffice it to say, this arrangement benefits us both. You gain financial stability, and I gain." She paused, her expression unreadable. "A reliable partner." The conversation ended with her handing him a sleek business card. "Think it over," she said coolly, "but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't linger." Jason left the cafe in a daze, the weight of her offer settling heavily on him. That night, as the rain continued to fall, he sat alone, the card on the table before him. It was a lifeline, one that came with strings he wasn't sure he could handle. Jason's small apartment felt suffocating as he paced back and forth, the enormity of Margaret's proposition gnawing at him. Unable to bear the uncertainty alone, he turned to the one person he trusted most, his mother. Her condition had worsened over the past year, and even as she reclined on the worn-out couch, her frailty was evident. Jason hesitated, but eventually explained Margaret's offer, his words stumbling as he recounted the bizarre meeting. His mother's reaction was a mix of shock and sadness. "Jason, this sounds wrong," she said softly, her voice weak but resolute. "But if it means you can pay for my treatments and secure your future, maybe it's worth considering. You've sacrificed so much already." Her words tore at Jason's conscience. Was he truly prepared to sacrifice his dignity for his family's survival? That night, he barely slept, his thoughts a storm of doubt and guilt. By dawn, exhaustion and desperation had tipped the scales. He made up his mind. Later that morning, Jason returned to Sinclair's Cafe, where Margaret awaited him with the same composed air. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside. Margaret nodded, as if she had anticipated his decision. "Good. I'll have my lawyer draft the necessary paperwork. We'll keep this quiet. No extravagant ceremonies, just a courthouse arrangement. You'll find that I value discretion." Within a week, the courthouse wedding took place. Jason stood in the sterile, impersonal room, reciting vows that felt hollow in his mouth. Margaret, ever the picture of poise, exchanged the words with a calm efficiency that left Jason feeling like a chess piece being moved into position. As they left the courthouse, Margaret turned to him with a faint smile. "Welcome to your new life, Jason." But as he stepped into the car waiting to take them to her estate, a gnawing unease settled in his gut. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a transaction, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just signed away more than his freedom. The car ride to Margaret Sinclair's estate was silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Jason Carter sat stiffly, glancing out the window as the cityscape gave way to sprawling countryside. Rain drizzled against the tinted glass, blurring the view of the towering gates that loomed ahead. When they arrived, Jason's breath caught. The Sinclair mansion was more fortress than home, a massive stone structure with ivy creeping up its walls. It exuded an air of cold grandeur, its tall windows dark and unwelcoming. Jason followed Margaret through the main entrance, the echo of their footsteps reverberating off marble floors. "Welcome to your new home," Margaret said, her voice devoid of warmth. A butler and 2 housemaids stood in the grand foyer, their postures rigid as they greeted him. Jason nodded, feeling the weight of their scrutinizing gazes. Margaret gestured toward the grand staircase. "You'll be staying in the East Wing. Your room has been prepared." As the butler led him down a series of long, dimly lit corridors, Jason couldn't shake the eerie atmosphere of the mansion. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow him as he passed. When the butler finally opened the door to his assigned room, Jason stepped inside, his unease growing. The room was opulent but lifeless, its heavy curtains drawn tight against the fading daylight. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, flanked by antique furniture that reeked of history. Yet for all its grandeur, the room felt more like a gilded cage than a place of comfort. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, served in a dining room that could have seated 20, though only Jason and Margaret were present. She sat at the head of the table, her sharp eyes observing him as they ate. "I trust you'll settle in quickly," she said between bites of perfectly seared salmon. Jason nodded, his appetite non-existent. "The house is impressive." A faint smirk touched Margaret's lips. "It's been in my family for generations. Sinclair legacy runs deep, though not without its scars." Her tone shifted, growing more cryptic. She mentioned her late husband briefly but offered no details, her words laced with an undercurrent of bitterness. Jason didn't press her, sensing it would only provoke her ire. That night, unable to sleep, Jason wandered the halls of the mansion. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. He passed numerous locked doors, their brass handles glinting in the faint moonlight filtering through high windows. He wondered what secrets they concealed. The mansion felt alive, its walls heavy with untold stories. Jason couldn't help but feel like an intruder, an outsider in a world that didn't want him there. Days turned into a week, and Jason's unease only deepened. The staff avoided him, their interactions clipped and formal. He noticed their furtive glances and the way they whispered in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't looking. Something was off, and the air of secrecy within the mansion began to gnaw at him. One afternoon, as he explored the estate grounds, Jason overheard 2 maids talking near the garden. "He doesn't know what he's gotten himself into," one whispered, her voice trembling. "Hush. If Mrs. Sinclair finds out we're talking," the other replied, her tone urgent. Jason's presence startled them, and they quickly scattered, leaving him with more questions than answers. What didn't he know? Determined to uncover the truth, Jason began paying closer attention to the mansion's inner workings. He noticed how the staff seemed almost fearful of Margaret, their movements precise and cautious in her presence. Her icy demeanor only reinforced their wariness. One evening, Jason wandered into Margaret's private study, an elegant room filled with dark wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something compelled him to investigate. On her desk lay an assortment of papers, neatly arranged, but what caught his eye was a small, ornate key sitting beside a leather-bound journal. Jason hesitated. Taking the key felt like crossing a line, but his curiosity outweighed his caution. He pocketed it, his pulse quickening as he exited the study as silently as he had entered. That night, he roamed the halls, key in hand, trying it on various locked doors. Most resisted, but eventually, one clicked open. Jason stepped inside, his breath hitching as he took in the room's contents. The space was a stark contrast to the rest of the mansion, intimate and personal, filled with photographs and trinkets that spoke of another side to Margaret Sinclair. He approached a desk, where an open diary lay, its pages filled with precise handwriting. As Jason skimmed the entries, a chill ran down his spine. The diary chronicled Margaret's turbulent past, her bitterness toward Jason's late father, and her meticulous planning to secure Jason as a pawn in her long-brewing vendetta. His heart pounded as the full weight of her manipulation sank in. This wasn't just a marriage. It was retribution, carefully orchestrated by a woman who harbored a seething grudge. Jason fled the room, his mind racing. The mansion's secrets were beginning to unravel, but he was no closer to understanding how to escape the web Margaret had spun around him. Jason couldn't shake the unease that followed his discovery in the locked room. The contents of Margaret's diary haunted him. The photographs, the accusations, and her calculated plan to ruin his life. His instinct screamed that he had to confront her, but he also knew he needed more answers before he could take any action. The next morning, Jason carried on as though nothing had changed. He joined Margaret for breakfast in the grand dining room, masking his turmoil behind a forced calm. Margaret, ever the composed and observant woman, didn't appear to notice anything amiss. She spoke of estate business and social events in her usual clipped tone, as if their marriage were nothing more than a contract she'd filed away. But beneath the surface, Jason's mind raced. Every glance, every word Margaret uttered felt like part of a game he hadn't agreed to play. That evening, with the mansion shrouded in quiet, Jason returned to the locked room. This time, he ventured deeper into the space, careful not to disturb anything that might alert Margaret to his intrusion. The walls were lined with shelves containing neatly labeled boxes, and the desk held more documents that painted a grim picture of Margaret's life. Among them, Jason found letters addressed to his late father, accusing him of fraudulent business practices that had led to the collapse of Margaret's family fortune. The letters were scathing, filled with bitter accusations that seemed to seethe from the pages. Jason's hands trembled as he read them, piecing together the timeline of events. Margaret's husband, it seemed, had suffered a heart attack shortly after the financial ruin, leaving her to fend for herself and carry the weight of her vendetta. It was personal, painfully so. Jason also discovered receipts and documents tying Margaret to questionable business dealings. Some involved leveraging her vast wealth to sway legal decisions, while others hinted at outright illegal activities. One particular set of papers caught his eye, a file containing records of his family's debts. It was as though Margaret had been tracking his life for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, Jason heard footsteps in the hallway. His heart leapt into his throat as he scrambled to extinguish the small desk lamp he'd turned on. The steps grew louder, pausing just outside the room. Jason froze, clutching a handful of the documents as the door creaked open. There she was, Margaret, her piercing gaze landing on him like a predator catching its prey. Margaret stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, though her sharp eyes betrayed a flicker of anger. Jason felt a surge of panic, but forced himself to stay composed. "Well," she said, her voice icy, "it seems you've taken quite an interest in my private affairs." Jason straightened, holding her gaze. "I needed answers, Margaret, and now I have them." She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with deliberate slowness. "You've overstepped," she said, her tone low and controlled. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Jason took a step forward, his pulse hammering. "I know the truth. You orchestrated this entire marriage to settle a score with my father. You've been planning this for years, haven't you?" Margaret didn't deny it. Instead, she let out a humorless laugh, circling the room with an almost predatory grace. "And what if I have? Do you think you're some kind of victim, Jason? Your father destroyed my family. Everything I've done has been to ensure justice." "Justice?" Jason's voice rose. "This isn't justice, it's revenge. You've manipulated me, dragged my family into your schemes, and for what? To satisfy some grudge against a man who isn't even alive to defend himself?" Margaret's composure cracked for the briefest moment, revealing a glimpse of the pain and anger simmering beneath her steely exterior. "Your father ruined us," she said, her voice trembling. "He lied, cheated, and left us to pick up the pieces. My husband died because of the stress he caused, and I was left with nothing." Nothing. Jason took a step back, the weight of her words sinking in. He could see the scars of her past, the bitterness that had consumed her, but it didn't justify her actions. "That doesn't give you the right to ruin my life," he said firmly. "You can't punish me for his mistakes." Margaret's expression hardened. "You think you can just walk away from this, don't you? Let me remind you, Jason, you're mine now. Legally, financially, and socially. Every move you make, every step you take, is under my control. If you try to fight me, you'll lose." Her words sent a chill down Jason's spine. He realized then that Margaret was more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. But even as fear gripped him, a spark of defiance flared within. "I'm not your pawn, Margaret," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm going to find a way out of this. Mark my words." Margaret smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made Jason's stomach churn. "You're welcome to try," she said. "But remember, Jason, I always win." As she left the room, Jason slumped against the desk, his mind racing. The battle lines had been drawn, and he knew the road ahead would be treacherous. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of determination. If Margaret Sinclair thought she could control him, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Jason awoke the next morning with a restless determination. The events of the previous night had solidified his resolve to fight back against Margaret's control, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. The sprawling mansion was filled with people, staff who knew Margaret's secrets better than anyone, but every interaction with them had been strained, shrouded in tension and caution. He needed to find someone who could help him navigate the dangerous waters he now found himself in. That evening, Jason sought out Mr. Harris, the estate's head butler. A man in his late 60s with a dignified air, Mr. Harris had always seemed unflinchingly loyal to Margaret. However, Jason had noticed something in his demeanor, a flicker of sympathy whenever their paths crossed. If anyone knew the truth about Margaret, it was him. Jason found Mr. Harris in the kitchen, meticulously arranging silverware for the next day's meal. The room was empty except for them, and the faint hum of the refrigerator masked their voices. "Mr. Harris," Jason began, his voice low, "I need to talk to you. Privately." The butler paused, his hands hovering over the silverware. He glanced around the room before nodding curtly. "Follow me, Mr. Caldwell." He led Jason to a small office tucked away in the servants' quarters. Once inside, Mr. Harris closed the door and turned to face him, his expression guarded. "What is it you need to say?" the butler asked. Jason hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I know Margaret brought me here for a reason. I've read the letters, her diary, everything. This marriage isn't about companionship or appearances. It's about revenge." Mr. Harris's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. "I need to know the truth," Jason pressed. "You've worked for her for years. You must know something, anything, that can help me." For a long moment, the butler said nothing. Then he sighed, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "You're right," he admitted. "This isn't the first time Margaret has used someone to further her own ends, but you're certainly the most significant pawn she's ever chosen." Jason's pulse quickened. "So, you've seen this before? What happened to the others?" "They all left," Mr. Harris said simply. "Broken, ruined, or worse. Margaret has a way of dismantling people's lives once they've served their purpose. You're walking a dangerous path, Mr. Caldwell." Jason clenched his fists. "I'm not going to let her destroy me. There has to be a way out of this." The butler hesitated, then leaned closer. "If you want to escape her grasp, you'll need more than determination. Margaret's power extends far beyond these walls, financially, legally, socially. She's always 3 steps ahead." "But," he trailed off, as if weighing his words. "But what?" Jason urged. "There might be someone who can help you," Mr. Harris said. "Someone outside this estate. Do you have anyone you trust?" Jason thought of Peter, his closest friend from law school. Peter was sharp, resourceful, and had a knack for finding loopholes in even the most ironclad situations. Yes, Jason said. Peter. He's a law student like me. He might know something about how to get out of this mess. Then you need to act quickly, Mr. Harris advised. But be careful. Margaret will notice if you step out of line, and she won't hesitate to tighten her grip. Jason nodded, his mind racing. He thanked the butler and left the office, a flicker of hope kindling within him. Jason didn't waste any time. The next day, under the guise of catching up on schoolwork, he contacted Peter. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in town, away from the prying eyes of Margaret's staff. When Jason arrived, Peter was already waiting, a concerned look on his face. What's going on, Jason? You sounded desperate. Jason slid into the seat across from him and lowered his voice. Peter, I need your help. I'm trapped in something I don't know how to get out of. He laid out the entire story, sparing no detail. Peter listened intently, his expression shifting from disbelief to concern as Jason recounted Margaret's schemes and the evidence he'd uncovered. This is insane, Peter said when Jason finished. But if everything you're saying is true, there might be a way to fight back. Jason leaned forward. How? Well, Peter said, pulling out a notepad. If Margaret coerced you into this marriage under false pretenses, that could be grounds to challenge its validity. But you'll need solid evidence. Documents, witnesses, anything that proves her intent? Jason nodded. I've already found some documents in her locked room. Letters accusing my father, records of shady business deals. It's enough to show her motives, isn't it? Peter frowned. It's a start, but you'll need more. Margaret's powerful, Jason. People like her don't go down easily. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Jason said firmly. I can't let her keep controlling my life. Peter hesitated, then leaned closer. There's one more thing. If Margaret's involved in illegal activities, exposing them could give you leverage. You said you found records of questionable deals? Jason nodded. Yes. There were documents about falsified reports and partnerships that seemed off. Then we need to dig deeper, Peter said. If we can prove she's breaking the law, not only can you get out of this marriage, but she could also face serious consequences. Jason felt a surge of hope. For the first time since he'd entered Margaret's world, he saw a path forward. Let's do it, he said. I'll gather whatever I can, and we'll build a case. As Jason left the cafe, he felt the weight of his situation lighten ever so slightly. The battle was far from over, but with Peter's help, he had a fighting chance. He returned to the mansion with renewed determination, ready to uncover the rest of Margaret's secrets. But as he stepped through the front doors, Margaret was waiting for him in the foyer, her eyes cold and calculating. Busy day, Jason? She asked, her tone deceptively light. Jason forced a smile, masking his unease. Just needed some fresh air. Margaret studied him for a moment, then turned and walked away. Jason's heart pounded as he ascended the staircase, knowing the clock was ticking. The truth was within his grasp, but so was Margaret's looming threat. Jason barely slept that night, his mind racing with plans and fears. The conversation with Peter had rekindled his hope, but Margaret's omnipresent shadow loomed large. Her calculating demeanor, as she greeted him upon his return from the cafe, haunted him. She knew something. The next morning, Jason awoke to the sound of firm knocks on his door. Before he could respond, the door creaked open and Margaret entered. She was impeccably dressed as always, her sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she approached. Jason, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, join me for breakfast? We have much to discuss. Her tone left no room for refusal. Jason threw on a shirt and followed her downstairs to the dining room, where an elaborate spread awaited. Margaret gestured for him to sit, then took her place at the head of the table. They ate in silence for a while, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. Finally, Margaret dabbed at her lips with a napkin and set it aside. You've been busy lately, she said, her voice deceptively calm. Jason froze but quickly composed himself. Just adjusting to everything here. It's a big change. Margaret tilted her head, her piercing gaze locking onto his. Adjusting, indeed. But I hope you remember that this arrangement works only if we trust each other. Secrets have a way of unraveling even the most well-laid plans. Jason's stomach churned. I'm not keeping secrets, he said, forcing himself to sound casual. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Don't insult my intelligence, Jason. I know you've been snooping around, and I know you've spoken to people outside this estate. Jason's heart pounded, but he kept his expression neutral. I haven't done anything wrong. I needed to clear my head, that's all. Margaret smiled thinly. Let me make this clear. I brought you into my world, and I can just as easily cast you out. But not without consequences, of course. You see, I've built a reputation on precision and control. I don't tolerate betrayal. Her words were a warning, but her tone carried a chilling finality. Jason realized that Margaret wasn't merely threatening his comfort. She was threatening his life, his future, and the people he cared about. Is that a threat? Jason asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. It's a reality, one you do well to accept. Don't test me, Jason. You won't like the outcome. Jason clenched his fists under the table, but he nodded, knowing that any defiance now would only escalate the danger. Margaret rose gracefully, her authority filling the room. I suggest you think carefully about your next moves, she said, her voice icy. Breakfast is over. Jason remained seated as she left the room, the weight of her presence lingering long after she was gone. He felt trapped, but his resolve only hardened. Margaret had underestimated him. The confrontation with Margaret left Jason shaken but more determined than ever. He spent the rest of the day meticulously going through the documents he had stolen from her locked room. Each page painted a damning picture of Margaret's activities, fraudulent business deals, coercion, and schemes that had destroyed lives, including his own father's. That evening, Jason contacted Peter, who had been working tirelessly to analyze the evidence. It's enough, Peter said confidently over the phone. We have everything we need to not only nullify the marriage, but to take her down legally. The question is, are you ready for the fallout? Jason took a deep breath. I'm ready. Let's end this. The next morning, Jason waited for Margaret in the sitting room, the evidence neatly compiled on the coffee table before him. When she entered, her expression was as composed as ever, but her eyes flicked to the files. You've been busy, she said, her tone devoid of emotion. Jason stood, his voice firm. It's over, Margaret. I know everything. The fraudulent deals, the lies about my father, your manipulations. I have the evidence to expose you. For the first time, Margaret's icy facade cracked. Her lips tightened, and a flicker of something, anger, fear, crossed her face. But she quickly regained her composure. And what do you intend to do with this evidence? She asked coolly. Jason met her gaze. I'm filing for annulment, and I'm taking this to the authorities. Your reign of control ends here. Margaret laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. You think you can defeat me? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I've crushed men far more powerful than you, Jason. You're nothing but a pawn. Jason stepped closer, his anger boiling over. I might be a pawn, but I'm not powerless. You've spent your life destroying others to fuel your own bitterness, but this ends now. You'll face the consequences of everything you've done. Their heated exchange filled the room, years of resentment and pain erupting in a battle of words. Margaret defended her actions as justified, claiming that everything she had done was to protect her family and avenge her husband's death. You have no idea what it's like to lose everything, she cried, her voice trembling with uncharacteristic emotion. Jason's voice softened, but his resolve remained unshaken. And you have no idea how many people you've hurt trying to fill that void. This cycle of revenge, it's poisoned you, Margaret. It's time to let it go. For a moment, silence hung between them. Margaret's icy exterior wavered, and Jason thought he saw a flicker of regret in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. You'll regret this, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Jason gathered the files and left the room, his heart pounding. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he also knew he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. The showdown had ended, but the war was far from won. Jason's decision to confront Margaret marked a turning point, but it also set in motion a series of escalating events. Margaret, for all her composure, was not one to accept defeat. The days following their confrontation were tense and fraught with subtle but undeniable threats. Jason noticed the change almost immediately. The staff avoided him even more than before, their eyes darting nervously whenever he passed. His meals were delivered with a mechanical politeness that only deepened his unease. Margaret herself maintained an icy distance, but her actions spoke louder than words. One evening, Jason returned to his room to find his belongings had been searched. Papers were displaced, drawers left slightly ajar. It was a warning, a demonstration of Margaret's reach within her own fortress. Jason's initial anger gave way to a cold determination. He couldn't let her intimidate him. The next morning, he received a package from Peter, delivered discreetly by courier. Inside was a finalized legal brief detailing their case against Margaret. Jason reviewed it carefully, the evidence of her fraudulent activities and coercion meticulously documented. If he filed it, it would not only annul their marriage but also open a legal investigation into her business dealings. That night, Jason sat in the library, the package beside him, when Margaret entered unannounced. She was dressed in a striking black gown, her presence commanding as ever. She walked over to the table, her heels echoing in the quiet room, and sat across from him. "You've made your move," she said calmly, her voice like ice. "Now, let me tell you what happens next." Jason didn't flinch. "I've done nothing wrong, Margaret. I'm only ensuring that justice is served." Margaret leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Justice? Do you think the world operates on justice, Jason? It runs on power, influence, and I have far more of both than you could ever imagine." Jason held her stare. "You might have power, but it won't save you from the truth. The evidence speaks for itself, Margaret. It's over." For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked. She stood abruptly, her voice rising. "Do you think you're better than me? Do you think your so-called integrity makes you untouchable? Let me remind you, Jason, that everything you have, your education, your family's security, exists because of me." Jason stood as well, his voice firm but controlled. "And I'm grateful for that. But I won't be your pawn anymore. Whatever happens next, I'm ready to face it." Their heated exchange left the room heavy with tension. Margaret's eyes burned with fury, but Jason saw something else flicker beneath the surface: fear. She turned on her heel and stormed out, leaving Jason to wonder what her next move would be. The next morning, Jason met Peter at a local courthouse. The briefcase containing the evidence felt heavier than it should, a tangible weight of the decision he was about to make. "You're sure about this?" Peter asked as they stood outside the courthouse steps. Jason nodded, his resolve unshaken. "I have to do this. For my family, for myself, and even for her. She needs to face the truth." Together, they filed the case, setting into motion a legal process that would unravel Margaret's carefully constructed empire. Back at the estate, the fallout began almost immediately. Jason received a call from the authorities, confirming they had begun investigating Margaret's business dealings. News spread quickly, and within days, Margaret's reputation began to crumble. Former associates distanced themselves, and the staff at the estate grew visibly uneasy. Margaret, however, remained defiant. She summoned Jason to her study one final time. "You've won," she said, her voice flat but laced with bitterness. "But don't think for a moment that you're walking away unscathed. The world doesn't forget betrayals, Jason. Neither do I." Jason met her gaze, his own filled with a quiet strength. "This isn't about winning or losing, Margaret. It's about doing what's right. I hope someday you'll understand that." Their conversation ended without fanfare, but as Jason walked out of the room, he felt a profound sense of closure. In the weeks that followed, Margaret faced the full weight of the law. Her businesses were dismantled, her assets frozen, and her influence diminished. Jason, meanwhile, returned to his studies, buoyed by the support of Peter and his mother. He moved out of the estate and into a modest apartment, where he finally felt free to rebuild his life. He poured himself into his legal education, determined to use his experiences to help others who had been wronged. One day, he received a letter from Margaret. It was short and cryptic, written in her elegant script. I underestimated you. Perhaps that was my mistake. Or perhaps it was my salvation. M. Jason folded the letter and set it aside, unsure of its meaning but unwilling to dwell on it. His future was ahead of him, unburdened by the shadows of the past. As he walked to class that morning, the sun breaking through the clouds, Jason felt a renewed sense of purpose. The ordeal with Margaret had tested him in ways he never thought possible, but it had also shaped him. He was no longer the desperate young man who had entered a gilded cage. He was stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. Jason stood at the edge of the courtyard, his gaze sweeping across the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city, as though the world itself was reminding him that no matter how dark the past had been, there was always a new dawn. The battle with Margaret had been more than just a fight for freedom. It had been a journey of self-discovery. He had faced temptation, fear, and the weight of his own moral compass. But through it all, he had found something far more precious than wealth or influence. He had found his integrity. In the months that followed, Jason's life slowly began to rebuild. His reputation, once overshadowed by Margaret's manipulations, now stood on solid ground. He had passed the bar exam with honors, and his name was beginning to circulate in the legal world. More importantly, he had regained control of his future, free from the chains of someone else's bitterness. As for Margaret, the world had moved on. She had faded into obscurity, her empire crumbling under the weight of her own schemes. Jason felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a quiet relief that he had not allowed her to define his destiny. The letter she had sent him, cryptic and brief, had been a strange acknowledgement of his victory, though Jason knew that it was not her apology that mattered. What mattered was that he had chosen the right path, one that would lead him toward a life built on truth, justice, and the lessons he had learned through adversity. And so, Jason walked forward, each step carrying him further away from the shadows of his past. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to embrace it, no longer a pawn in anyone else's game, but the master of his own future. With the weight of the past behind him, Jason finally allowed himself to dream of what could be, confident that no matter the challenges, he would always have the strength to overcome them. And in the end, that was enough. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. We hope you enjoyed the journey of Jason's growth, his challenges, and his triumphs. Your support means the world to us, and we are grateful for your attention and engagement throughout this entire experience. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content like this. Your feedback and support help us to keep creating and improving with each new story. Stay tuned for more adventures, and we can't wait to have you with us again. Until next time, take care and keep believing in your own journey. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more.